Before we dive in, let me ask you something. What's the first thing that comes to mind when you think of Starbucks? Maybe it's that pumpkin spice latte you wait for every fall. Maybe it's the green mermaid logo. Or maybe it's just the place where you pick up your morning coffee without even thinking twice. But behind the seasonal drinks, behind the cozy vibe, and the billions of cups served every year, there's another story. A darker one. A story of exploitation, environmental destruction, child labor, and some of the most tone-deaf corporate scandals you can imagine. And that's what we're talking about today, so grab your cup, whether it's coffee, tea, or water, and settle in. Because once you hear what's really hiding behind that green logo, you may never look at Starbucks the same way again. Chapter 1. From Luxury to Everyday. The Journey of Coffee. When I think about coffee today, it feels like something so normal, so ordinary, that it's almost strange to imagine a world without it. We pick it up on the way to work, we brew it half asleep in our kitchens, we scroll through our phones while sipping it. But coffee wasn't always the people's drink. In fact, for a long time, it was reserved only for the elite. If you were poor, if you were just trying to survive day to day, coffee wasn't even an option. It was for the wealthy, the powerful, the chosen few. That changed during the Industrial Revolution, a period that spanned from the mid-1700s to the early 1800s. Factories were springing up everywhere, cities were swelling with workers leaving their farms behind, and new technologies made it possible to produce goods more quickly, more cheaply, and for more people. Things that had once been luxuries like spices, sugar, even coffee suddenly became accessible to the everyday person. And once people had a taste of coffee, well, let's just say they weren't about to give it up. In America, two names became practically synonymous with coffee during this shift: Folgers and Maxwell House. These brands started packaging and selling coffee in grocery stores, making it something anyone could take home and brew. No longer was coffee just a rich man's indulgence. Now it was in the kitchens of families across the country, fueling workers before long shifts, keeping students awake at night, and making its way into the rhythm of ordinary life. Historians often talk about the waves of coffee. The first wave stretched from about 1950 to 1970, when coffee became a true staple. It was everywhere: diners, homes, workplaces, cheap, instant, convenient. It didn't matter if the taste was a little bitter or flat, people weren't drinking it for luxury. They were drinking it because it kept them moving. Coffee became fuel for America's deadlines and exhaustion. But culture changes, and so do people's expectations. By the 1970s, something was shifting. Coffee was no longer just a sidekick to your pie at a diner. People began visiting coffee shops specifically for coffee, as if it was something to savor, not just gulp down on your way to somewhere else. The simple drink was starting to feel a little more special, maybe even a little indulgent again. And then came the 1990s. If you were around back then, you probably remember shows like Friends and Seinfeld. These weren't just TV comedies, they shaped how people thought about their daily lives. Suddenly, hanging out in a coffee shop wasn't just for the eccentric intellectual or the beat poet. It was mainstream. It was cool. Coffee shops became what sociologists call the third place: not home, not work, but somewhere in between. A space where people could linger, laugh, gossip, or just be. And with that cultural shift came a new attitude. People didn't just want a black coffee with cream and sugar anymore. They wanted something that felt like theirs. A latte, a cappuccino, a frappuccino, shaken iced, flavored with vanilla or caramel. Coffee became customizable, like an extension of personality. It wasn't just a drink, it was an identity. This set the stage for a giant to rise. A company that would take coffee from something you brewed at home or ordered in a diner and transform it into a global culture, a symbol, a lifestyle. That company, of course, was Starbucks. Chapter 2. The Birth of Starbucks. When we think of Starbucks today, we picture that familiar green logo, the long lines in the morning, and those paper cups with misspelled names. But the story of how it all began is a little stranger, and honestly a lot more humble than the empire we know now. It started in Seattle in 1971. Back then, coffee wasn't the cultural icon it is today. It was still mostly something you drank at home, maybe from a can of Folgers or Maxwell House. But three friends, Jerry Baldwin, Zev Siegel, and Gordon Bowker, decided they wanted to do something different. They were obsessed with coffee and not the weak, bitter kind that people were used to. They wanted to bring high-quality, freshly roasted beans to people who had never even considered coffee could taste, well, special. The three had learned the art of coffee roasting from Alfred Peet, the man behind Peet's Coffee. If you've ever walked past a Peet's, you might notice it still has this reputation for rich, almost intense coffee. That's the kind of education these three men got. And when they opened their first little shop in Seattle's Pike Place Market, they weren't even serving coffee drinks. You couldn't sit down and sip a latte. Starbucks at the very beginning was just a store where you bought beans and brewing equipment. You'd take it home, make it yourself, and maybe feel a little more sophisticated. The name, that's a funny story. They wanted something that felt adventurous, nautical romantic, even something that hinted at the exotic origins of coffee. One suggestion was Pequod, the whaling ship from Moby Dick, but that sounded a little too harsh. So they settled on the name of the ship's first mate, Starbuck. Add an S, and suddenly Starbucks was born. Even the logo reflected that nautical theme, an old brown design featuring a siren, a twin-tailed mermaid, drawn in a way that was, let's just say, a lot more anatomically correct than the modest green mermaid we see today. For more than a decade, Starbucks remained this small, almost boutique-style shop. It wasn't on every corner, it wasn't yet a cultural icon. It was just a little Seattle secret. And then along came a man named Howard Schultz. Schultz first walked into a Starbucks store in 1981. He was working for a company that sold coffee machines, and he noticed something different about this tiny business. It had passion, it had potential. In 1982, he joined the company as the head of marketing. But it wasn't until a trip to Milan, Italy, that he truly saw what Starbucks could become. In Italy, coffee shops weren't just shops. They were hubs of community. People lingered over espresso, conversations flowed, and coffee wasn't just fuel, it was an experience. Schultz came back to Seattle inspired. He wanted Starbucks to be more than a place to buy beans. He wanted it to be what he called the third place, not home, not work, but somewhere in between, a place people belonged. But when he pitched this idea to the original founders, they weren't impressed. They liked Starbucks the way it was selling beans, not brewing lattes. They couldn't imagine Americans sitting around in coffee shops like the Italians did. So Schultz left. He opened his own little chain of coffee bars called Il Giornale. And guess what? It worked. By 1987, Schultz was ready to take things further. He gathered investors, raised money, and bought Starbucks outright. At that time, Starbucks only had about 20 stores. Under Schultz, it exploded. Within just a few years, there were hundreds. By the year 2000, there were more than 2,500. The little brown mermaid had transformed into a global giant, and the world was hooked. But here's the thing about success on that scale. It always comes with a cost. Schultz had dreamed of cozy, Italian-style cafes, filled with conversation and community. Instead, Starbucks began to look more like the Walmart of coffee, mass-produced everywhere, predictable. People brought laptops instead of conversations. Stores became extensions of offices. The culture was changing, and Starbucks was changing with it. Still, there's no denying the impact. Starbucks didn't just sell coffee. It sold an identity, a ritual, a feeling. Suddenly, carrying a Starbucks cup became a symbol. It meant you were busy, important, maybe even a little sophisticated. It was branding genius. And while this rise might sound like a dream, it also set the stage for something darker. Because once a company grows this big, this fast, the cracks start to show. The shiny image of community and connection hides questions about what's really inside that cup, who's paying the price, and what Starbucks is willing to do to stay on top. Chapter 3: What's Really in the Cup. For most of us, when we walk into a Starbucks, we're not really thinking about what's inside the cup. We just know what we want. Maybe a pumpkin spice latte, maybe a caramel macchiato, or maybe just a plain iced coffee to get through the day. But when I started digging into the ingredients, I realized that what seems simple coffee, milk, sugar, has a much darker side. Let's start with milk. For years, Starbucks was using milk from cows that had been treated with something called recombinant bovine growth hormone, or RBGH. Sounds like a science experiment, right? Well, in a way, it was. RBGH was a synthetic hormone approved by the FDA back in 1993 to make cows produce more milk. Great for profits, not so great for the cows. It caused painful health problems like infections, swollen udders, and overall poor health. And here's the kicker: RBGH was banned in Europe and Canada because of these risks. But in the US, Starbucks kept using it until 2008. They knew it was controversial as early as the year 2000, and they even claimed they were moving away from it. But for almost a decade after that promise, nothing happened. It wasn't until public pressure became impossible to ignore that Starbucks finally announced they were going RBGH free. So while millions of us were sipping our lattes thinking nothing of it, the milk inside came from cows suffering because of a hormone the rest of the world refused to use. Now let's talk about sugar. And listen, I'm not here to ruin anyone's frappuccino, but we need to be honest. Some of these drinks are sugar bombs in disguise. Take the venti mocha cookie crumble frappuccino. Sounds delicious, right? Well, it packs nearly 600 calories. For comparison, that's more than a McDonald's Big Mac. Even a grande pumpkin spice latte, which feels almost innocent, clocks in at nearly 400 calories. That's not just coffee, that's practically a full meal. And the irony is that Starbucks markets these drinks as little pick-me-ups, treats that make the day better, which they do for a moment. But they also fuel a cycle of sugar highs and crashes, and long-term, they're not doing our bodies any favors. For a company that prides itself on being part of people's wellness routines, it's worth questioning how much wellness there really is in a cup with more sugar than a soda. Then came the alternatives: soy milk, almond milk, coconut milk. Starbucks leaned into the idea that you had choices, that you could be health conscious and still enjoy your favorite drinks. And for a while, these seemed like saviors. Soy milk especially had its big moment, practically becoming a lifestyle. But the truth: most of these alternatives are highly processed, often packed with added sugar, and in many cases, they're not the clean, healthy solutions people think they are. They're just different versions of the same problem. And maybe that's the point. Starbucks doesn't really sell health. It sells comfort. It sells identity. You know, when you pick up that cup with the green logo, you're part of something bigger. It's about the feeling, not the nutrition label. And they know that. But here's what sticks with me: behind that comforting ritual are choices that put profits first. Hormones in milk that made cows sick, drinks with sugar levels that would shock most people if they looked closely, alternatives marketed as healthy but filled with hidden additives. It makes you wonder how much of Starbucks' image is crafted and how much is real. Because once you peel back that green logo, you start to realize the cup you're holding isn't as innocent as it looks. And the further we look, the more we see that Starbucks' impact isn't just about what happens to us, it's also about what happens to the planet. Chapter 4: Coffee Cups and the Cost to the Planet. When most of us think about Starbucks, we picture cozy cafes, seasonal drinks, and that little green mermaid logo smiling back at us from a cup. What we don't usually picture is deforestation, orangutans losing their homes, or millions of trees being cut down every single year just so we can sip a latte on our way to work. But that's the reality hiding behind those cups. Back in 2013, Starbucks was called out for one of its key ingredients in baked goods: palm oil. Now, palm oil might not sound all that sinister. It's used in all kinds of everyday products, from snacks to shampoos. But here's the thing: harvesting palm oil has absolutely devastated rainforests in countries like Indonesia and Malaysia. Entire ecosystems wiped out to make room for plantations. Experts say that around half of the natural forests in those countries have already been destroyed because of it. And the cost isn't just trees. Palm oil farming has been directly linked to the deaths of over 50,000 orangutans. Imagine that for a moment, tens of thousands of these incredible animals gone, all so corporations can keep production cheap. Orangutans are now critically endangered, and while Starbucks wasn't the only company using palm oil, it's hard to excuse the fact that they kept doing it for so long, even after the damage was widely known. It's one of those moments that makes you stop and think, is a pumpkin loaf or a cake pop really worth an entire species being pushed to the edge of extinction? And then there are the cups. Something so simple, so ordinary, that you wouldn't even think twice about them. but back in 2008, Starbucks was using about 4 billion cups a year. 4 billion. That translates to roughly 1.6 million trees being cut down annually just for cups. Now Starbucks tried to soften the blow by printing a recycling symbol on those cups. You know the little triangle arrows that make you feel good when you toss something in the bin. Well, it turns out that was misleading. Those cups weren't actually recyclable in most places. They were coated with a thin plastic lining that kept your drink hot but made the cups almost impossible to process at recycling facilities. So while customers thought they were doing something good for the planet, the truth was, most of those cups ended up in landfills. And when an investigation exposed this, Starbucks promised change. In 2008, they pledged to develop a fully recyclable cup by 2015 and to serve at least a quarter of their drinks in reusable containers. It sounded like progress. But here we are years later, and that magical recyclable cup still doesn't exist. Starbucks has pushed the deadline again and again, even promising 2023 would finally be the year. But as of now, the problem remains. Billions of cups, millions of trees, and a whole lot of empty promises. And I think what bothers me most is that this wasn't some accident. It wasn't Starbucks saying, oops, we didn't realize. They knew. They had the resources to fix it, and they had the public pressure to act. But instead of solving the problem, they leaned on marketing symbols, campaigns, pledges, while the reality behind the scenes didn't change. It's one thing when a company sells us sugar bombs disguised as coffee. It's another when the price isn't just our health, but the planet itself. And that's the part that's hard to shake. Because every time we walk into a Starbucks, we're not just buying a drink, we're buying into a system that has already cost rainforests, endangered animals, and millions of trees. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, how much damage are we willing to overlook for convenience? Because as bad as all of this sounds, Starbucks' most embarrassing moment wasn't about cows, orangutans, or cups. It was about people. And the way they handled conversations around race turned into one of the company's biggest disasters. Chapter 5. Race Coffee and the company's biggest misstep. You know, Starbucks has always tried to sell itself as more than just a coffee shop. They want to be part of the culture, part of people's daily rituals, even part of social change. And sometimes that backfires in the most awkward, cringy ways possible. Back in 2015, Starbucks decided it was going to lead a national conversation on race. That's right, your local barista, the one trying to remember how to spell your name on a cup, was suddenly being asked to spark deep conversations about one of the most sensitive issues in America. The campaign was called Race Together. For 1 week, Starbucks told baristas to write the hashtag #OtterRaceTogether on customers' cups. The idea was that while you were waiting for your latte, you might also be inspired to talk about racial inequality. On paper, maybe it sounded bold. In practice, it was a train wreck. Imagine ordering a cappuccino on your way to work, and suddenly the person making your drink is asking if you want to unpack systemic racism before they steam your milk. People didn't know whether to laugh, cringe, or get angry. Social media exploded with backlash. Within 48 hours, the campaign had 2.5 billion reactions online, and most of them were negative. Business Insider even called it the most embarrassing moment in Starbucks' history. And honestly, they weren't wrong. But here's the thing, it didn't end there. Just a few years later, in 2018, Starbucks found itself in the middle of a real racial controversy. In Philadelphia, 2 black men were waiting at a Starbucks for a business meeting. They hadn't ordered yet because they were waiting for their colleague to arrive. But the store manager didn't like that they were sitting there without buying anything. Instead of treating them like customers, the manager called the police. What happened next was shocking. The 2 men were arrested, handcuffed, walked out in front of everyone for doing nothing more than waiting for a friend. Their business associate even showed up during the arrest and confirmed the whole thing was a misunderstanding, but by then it was too late. The images spread across the news and social media like wildfire, and suddenly Starbucks wasn't the coffee shop with seasonal lattes, it was the company accused of racial profiling. Howard Schultz, the company's former CEO, called it a moment of shame. Starbucks issued a public apology, saying it stood firmly against discrimination or racial profiling. But apologies only go so far. To show they were serious, Starbucks shut down over 8,000 of its stores for a day of racial bias training. It was a dramatic gesture, but many employees later said the training felt shallow, even performative. And that's the problem, isn't it? A company can say the right things, they can put hashtags on cups, they can hold training sessions. But if the culture doesn't change, if people's real experiences don't improve, then what does it matter? Starbucks wanted to be seen as progressive, inclusive, and socially aware. But in those moments, what came through wasn't leadership. It was a disconnect. A company trying to package something as complex as race into a marketing campaign and then being blindsided when reality showed them just how far they still had to go. It's one of those times where you realize image and reality don't always line up. Starbucks wanted to be part of the conversation on race, but instead, it exposed how unprepared it was to handle the responsibility. And while the news cycle eventually moved on, the memory stuck. For many people, those two men in Philadelphia became a symbol of everything Starbucks claimed it stood against, but in that moment failed to prevent. And yet, even with that controversy, Starbucks has another claim to fame. It loves to advertise being fair trade. But once again, when you look behind the green logo, the story isn't as clean as the company wants you to believe. Chapter 6: The Fair Trade Illusion. When you walk into a Starbucks, it's hard not to notice the words fair trade. They're on posters on the packaging, sometimes even on the cups. And the message is clear: by buying your coffee here, you're not just fueling your caffeine habit, you're supporting farmers around the world, making the world a better place one latte at a time. It sounds noble, doesn't it? It makes you feel good about spending $6 on a drink. But here's where the story gets messy. Because as much as Starbucks wants to wear the fair trade badge, the reality for many coffee farmers, especially in places like Ethiopia, has been far from fair. In 2006, an 85-year-old Ethiopian farmer named Jamide Robe left his village for the first time in his life. Why? To tell the truth about what was happening to farmers like him. Jamidi had been working with an international organization called Oxfam, and together they were pushing Starbucks to sign an agreement that would give Ethiopian farmers more control over their own coffee. Now, Ethiopia isn't just any coffee-producing country, it's the birthplace of coffee. Some of the most sought-after beans in the world come from there. In the US, a pound of these specialty beans could sell for as much as $26. But the farmers who grew and harvested them, they were making less than $1 per pound. That's not fair trade, that's exploitation. So what did Starbucks do when Ethiopia asked for a better deal? They refused. They filed legal paperwork opposing Ethiopia's position. Think about that. A multi-billion-dollar company worth over $6 billion at the time was fighting against giving farmers even a sliver of a fairer price. If Starbucks had agreed, Ethiopia's coffee market could have earned an extra $88 million every year. For farmers living in poverty, that money could have meant stability, education for their children, even survival. Instead, Starbucks stalled. They hid behind legal language while continuing to market themselves as a company that cared about farmers. And it wasn't until the public found out that things began to change. When people realized the truth that Starbucks was blocking Ethiopian farmers from earning a fair wage, the outrage grew. The campaign against Starbucks spread like wildfire. It wasn't built on flashy ads or smear tactics. It was simple: honor your commitment to coffee farmers. Communities, students, activists, even Starbucks' own employees joined in. Over 100,000 people got involved, turning what seemed like a small fight into a David versus Goliath battle. And finally, in June 2007, Starbucks gave in. They agreed to let Ethiopian farmers trademark and license their own coffee names, giving them more power in the global market. It was hailed as a victory, a sign that persistence and public pressure could push even the biggest corporations to change. But here's the question that still lingers: why did it take so much effort just to convince Starbucks to do the bare minimum? Why did it take a global campaign to get them to acknowledge the people at the heart of their empire, the farmers who grow the beans? The truth is, fair trade at Starbucks often feels less like a promise and more like a marketing tool. Something designed to make us feel good while we sip our lattes without forcing the company to give up too much profit. And once you see that pattern, it becomes hard to unsee. Because if Starbucks could fight this hard to avoid paying Ethiopian farmers a fair price, what else might they be hiding? And sadly, the answer to that question is even darker. Because not long after evidence emerged that some of the beans ending up in Starbucks cups were being picked by children. Chapter 7: The Children Behind the Beans. When we think about coffee, we picture cozy mornings, laptops at cafes, or maybe just trying to survive another workday. What we don't picture, what Starbucks doesn't want us to picture, are children working under brutal conditions to pick the very beans that end up in our cups. In 2020, a British documentary program called Channel 4's Dispatches decided to investigate the coffee supply chain. Their team visited 12 different farms that supplied beans to Starbucks, and what they found was devastating. On every single farm, children were working kids under the age of 13. Some were as young as 8. These weren't kids helping out for a couple of hours after school. They were filmed working full days, 40-hour weeks, often in extreme heat with little to no breaks. They carried heavy loads, worked with dangerous farming equipment, and faced conditions no child should ever have to endure. And for what? For pay that was almost non-existent. These kids were compensated based on the weight of beans they picked. After an entire day of exhausting labor, the money they earned was often less than the cost of a Starbucks latte. Think about that. A child could spend hours in the fields under the scorching sun, and the reward might not even be enough to buy the drink made from the beans they harvested. When this investigation was made public, Starbucks rushed to respond. They released a statement saying they had a zero-tolerance policy for child labor. They promised to investigate to take action. But here's the thing, this wasn't the first time child labor concerns had been raised in the coffee industry. Starbucks knew these risks existed, and yet the supply chain they relied on still led straight back to children in the fields. And the so-called solution, Starbucks said it would stop buying from the farms caught in the investigation. But that decision wasn't as clean as it sounded. Because if Starbucks pulled out those farms, and the families depending on them could lose what little income they had, it was a lose-lose situation. Children were being exploited, yes, but cutting ties didn't magically erase the poverty that drove them into those fields in the first place. What this investigation really exposed was the staggering imbalance of power and profit. A cup of Starbucks coffee in 2020 sold for about $3.17. After expenses, Starbucks made roughly 32 cents in profit on each cup. Meanwhile, the farmers, the very people who grew the beans, earned only about 1 cent per cup. And the children, they earned even less. It's hard to reconcile that image, the shiny green logo, the cozy stores, the seasonal drinks, with the reality of kids laboring in dangerous conditions, just so Starbucks could keep fueling its empire. And once you know that truth, it's impossible not to look at your coffee differently. But exploitation hasn't just happened on distant farms. Starbucks has also faced major criticism right here at home from its own workers, and that fight over unions' wages and dignity is still unfolding. Chapter 8: Brewing Rebellion, Workers versus the Green Giant. When we think of Starbucks, we usually picture the customer side of things, the friendly barista who remembers our order, the warm cafe with its playlist of acoustic covers, maybe the convenience of a drive-thru on a busy morning. But behind that polished image are workers who have been fighting their own quiet battle. For years, Starbucks employees have complained about low wages, unpredictable schedules, and a lack of real benefits. And while the company has always marketed itself as progressive, touting things like tuition programs or health coverage, the reality for many workers on the ground feels very different. Take scheduling, for example. Many baristas have said their hours were constantly cut or shuffled, making it nearly impossible to plan a second job pay rent or even know when they'd be working from one week to the next. And let's be honest, when you're making just above minimum wage, every single hour matters. So, in recent years, something started brewing inside Starbucks, not in the coffee machines, but among its workers. Union talk. Employees began organizing, demanding higher pay, safer conditions, and a real voice at the table. And for a company that built its brand on being worker-friendly, Starbucks didn't exactly welcome the movement with open arms. In fact, accusations quickly surfaced that Starbucks was doing everything it could to block unions. Workers said their hours were slashed after speaking out. Others claimed managers deliberately scheduled them at odd times or spread fear about what unionizing might cost them. Some employees even described the environment as hostile, like Starbucks was more focused on silencing them than actually listening. And yet the push for unions has grown. Store by store, city by city baristas have banded together filing petitions, voting, and proving that the green giant can't stop them all. It hasn't been easy. There's been tension lawsuits and headlines. But through it all, Starbucks employees have made one thing clear: they're not just pouring coffee, they're demanding respect. What strikes me most about this is the irony. Starbucks built its empire on the idea of being a third place, not home, not work, but somewhere in between where everyone belongs. Yet for so many of the people behind the counter, Starbucks has felt less like a place of belonging and more like a machine that chews them up and spits them out. The fight for unions at Starbucks isn't just about coffee shops, it's part of a much bigger story about workers in America pushing back against massive corporations. And the outcome will shape not just the future of Starbucks, but maybe even the future of how companies treat the people who keep them running. But if you think Starbucks is unique in this, think again. Because when you zoom out, the coffee industry as a whole has its own skeletons in the closet. And some of them go all the way back to history's darkest chapters. Chapter 9. Beyond Starbucks, the dark legacy of coffee empires. By now it's pretty clear that Starbucks isn't the only coffee giant with skeletons in its closet. If anything, Starbucks is just the most visible. The green mermaid is everywhere, which makes it an easy target, but when you zoom out and look at the entire coffee industry, the picture gets even darker. Let's start with Peet's Coffee. Remember Alfred Peet, the man who taught Starbucks founders how to roast beans? His company Peet's Coffee and Tea was once seen as a more ethical, artisanal alternative. But in the end, even Peet's didn't stay independent. It was bought out by a massive German conglomerate called JAB Holdings. And that's where things get unsettling. JAB Holdings doesn't just own Peet's. They own Keurig Stumptown Caribou Coffee, Panera Bread, even Krispy Kreme. If you've ever had a pastry with your latte, chances are JAB had a hand in it. Their reach stretches across the globe, creating a quiet monopoly on everyday food and drinks. But here's the part that made me stop in my tracks. The Raimond family, the billionaires behind JB, built their fortune in part by supporting Hitler during World War II. Historical investigations revealed that they used Nazi-sanctioned slave labor to grow their empire, profiting directly from human suffering. According to CNN, much of JAB's wealth owes its entire fortune to Nazism. Think about that for a second. Millions of us grab coffee every morning without realizing that the profits trace back to some of history's darkest chapters. It's not just about caffeine or convenience anymore, it's about legacies built on exploitation and cruelty. And it forces us to ask a hard question: is there such a thing as an innocent cup of coffee? Because Starbucks, for all its controversies, isn't alone in this. Nespresso, Nestle, Dunkin' McCafe, they all tap into global supply chains riddled with the same problems: unfair wages, environmental destruction, child labor, corporate greed. One brand might get caught in the headlines, but behind the scenes, they all share the same flawed system. It's sobering, isn't it? Coffee is supposed to be comforting, a ritual, a moment of peace. Yet the industry behind it is scarred by greed, corruption, and even ties to atrocities that most of us would rather not think about as we sip from our mugs. And maybe that's the hardest truth of all, that when it comes to coffee, there are no clean hands. The companies are too big, too powerful, too interconnected. So the real choice for us, the consumers, becomes whether we keep ignoring these stories or whether we start looking for better options, even if they're smaller, less convenient, or more expensive. Because if we keep turning a blind eye, the cycle will never end. Chapter 10. The last sip. Where do we go from here? After everything we've uncovered, the farmers struggling to survive, the children in the fields, the destroyed rainforests, the workers silenced at home, it's hard to look at a cup of Starbucks the same way again. Coffee. This simple drink that so many of us rely on to start our day turns out to have a history filled with exploitation lies and power plays. But here's the thing, it's not just about Starbucks. It's the entire coffee industry. An industry that thrives on convenience and image while hiding the ugly realities behind its supply chains. The green logo, the cozy cafes, the seasonal drinks they're designed to make us feel good, to give us a sense of belonging. But beneath it all, the real story is about profit, often at the expense of people and the planet. And that leaves us, the consumers, with a choice. We can keep pretending we don't know, shrug it off, and grab the nearest latte. Or we can start asking harder questions. Where is my coffee coming from? Who grew these beans? What kind of world am I supporting? With every sip, I'm not saying it's easy. Let's be honest, Starbucks is everywhere. It's fast, it's familiar, it's addictive. But if there's one lesson in all of this, it's that change doesn't happen when companies suddenly grow a conscience. It happens when people demand it, when Ethiopian farmers speak out, when workers unionize, when documentaries expose the truth, when consumers stop accepting the pretty picture and start insisting on something real. So maybe the answer isn't to give up coffee entirely. Maybe the answer is to look closer, to support local shops, to seek out roasters who actually practice what they preach, even if it costs a little more. Because every dollar we spend is a vote, and right now, those votes are shaping the future of an industry that touches millions of lives. At the end of the day, coffee should bring people together, not tear communities apart. It should be about warmth, connection, and comfort, not exploitation and controversy. But whether that future becomes reality is up to us. And that's the dark truth hiding in your cup. So there it is, the dark history of Starbucks. From its humble beginnings in Seattle to its rise as a global empire to the controversies that still haunt it today. Coffee is supposed to be comforting, a ritual we all share. But as we've seen, the industry behind it is built on profit power and sometimes exploitation. And here's the part that sticks with me. Starbucks isn't the only one. The whole coffee industry is tangled in these same issues. Which means the question isn't just, should I stop going to Starbucks? The question is, what kind of world am I supporting every time I buy a cup of coffee? I'd love to hear what you think. Would you still grab your daily latte after knowing all this? Or does it make you want to look for smaller, fairer alternatives? Share your thoughts in the comments or tag me with 9 true crime echoes so we can keep the conversation going. Thank you for staying with me through this story. Remember, never be afraid to ask questions, to dig deeper, and to challenge the picture companies want you to believe. Because sometimes the darkest truths are hiding in plain sight. Until next time, take care of yourself, make good choices, and I'll talk to you soon.